series. My name is Walter Zawitsky. Over the last 3 months, I've had the privilege of being the event's program coordinator, and today I will have the distinct honor of being its host moderator. As tradition has shaped the now venerable forum, I will, before turning to the opening remark session with our two distinguished guests, touch very, very shortly on two matters. We've come to call them the why and the how of the gathering, or simply the context of our discussion and the rules of the discussion. So very quickly onto the why, and this is something that has been repeated almost 25 years now. But I think it's important this year, more than any, that it be done to underline the import of the anniversary being highlighted. It turns out that 25 years ago, in the millennial 1999-2000 period, the core sponsoring organizations of today's forum, call them the American Friends of Ukraine, witnessed a critical geopolitical paradigm shift. For one, Ukraine, while still recovering from its Soviet past, signaled through both its executive branch and its legislature its intention to head west, or more precisely, to ultimately become a paid-up member of the Euro-Atlantic community, with ever stronger bilateral ties to the United States and to neighbor Canada, as well as eventual membership in EU and NATO as a final outcome. Equally critical to the equation, the policymakers and shapers in the United States in bipartisan fashion responded to the initiative in a very positive way, quickly embracing the notion of a burgeoning strategic partnership between the two nations. Delighted by the development, these self-same American Friends of Ukraine decided to put together a forum to study the phenomena more closely. They aptly called it Ukraine's Quest for Mature Nation Statehood, a roundtable. 2 days of intense discussion, highlighted by iconic figures like Zbigniew Brzezinski, Paul Wolfowitz, Senator Mitch McConnell, Representative Sandy Levin, Foreign Minister Boris Tarashuk, Prime Minister's Chief of Staff Olga Kryvachuk, Ambassador Dan Fried, and Ambassador Bill Taylor, established that the perceived paradigm shift was desired by all parties involved. As a result, the organizers decided to repeat the event annually and use the said gatherings, done as trilogies, to monitor the progress of Ukraine's Western vector, to explore what overarching standards had to be met and what paths had to be chosen in order to achieve the desired Euro-Atlantic result. An example trilogy was RT 7 to 9, which touched on relations with bilateral Western or pro-Western entities like EU, NATO, and Guam. The situational, things like elections, various purported scandals, ever-shifting political alliances, protests, provocations, were essentially ignored. So for the first few years, and especially after the successful Orange Revolution, matters seemed to accelerate the stated paradigm shift. With that, the Quest series, in addition to its own ongoings, generated breakaway gatherings, energy dialogues, security dialogues, business networking forums, historical encounters events. We also initiated Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic Future theme internationally, with forums in Ottawa, Brussels, London, Warsaw, Berlin, and Paris. Starting in 2011, however, the prescribed process hit a serious hiccup. At one point, the raison d'etre of the Quest Roundtable series seemed to be in question. As the Yanukovych presidency began to reveal its darker side in both foreign policy and domestic policy, the situational increasingly impinged on the overarching. In fact, the overarching, Ukraine's chosen path west, no longer seemed so overarching. Fear grew that the path west was not irrevocable or a done deal, that in fact the opposite tendencies were appearing. During that time, the Quest Roundtable series, rather than surrendering, took a different tack. For 3 years, the organizers took to measuring how badly the regression had gone. And we created what was called the annual report card, which would measure 6 criterion: levels of democracy, economic well-being, general security, energy security, social cohesion, and national identity. 2014, when its Euromaidan revolution and the ouster of Yanukovych clearly realigned Ukraine's stars to face the West again, and this time far more decisively. Just note the name. At the same time, however, the Kremlin decided to punish Ukraine for its choice by invading Crimea and creating a previously undetectable conflict zone in Donbass, recognizing that any conflict, or more bluntly, war, could still do damage to Ukraine's dream of Euro-Atlantic life. The Ukraine Quest Roundtable organizers decided to split the difference. And so they set up two gatherings. One that was in October that would continue to do the overarching issues, which is what we are about, and a second to do the report cards, which would follow with this situation. From that point on, in 15, 9 more roundtables or trilogies have occurred. In the last 3, a new dimension, ostensibly the highest importance, has been added: the Russian-Ukrainian war. While initially threatening to be the ultimate disruptor of the westward march by Ukraine, in fact, Vlad the Bad probably thought it would be, the conflict has actually ironically prompted Ukraine to ever more emphatically insist on its Euro-Atlantic future. In this regard, please simply note the victory plan that President Zelensky unveiled in his recent visits to DC and the Ramstein NATO summits, as well as powerful address to the United Nations, meant to dissuade all players, asking Ukraine to revisit any part of its terrifying colonial past. This year's roundtable, and I finally be able to end this opening, will have 2 aspects to it. In fact, the forum is advertised as designed to feature what amounts to 2 events. The morning sessions are tasked to look back and evaluate the overall results of the Western Vector Pledge, stronger bilateral ties with US and Canada, plus eventual membership in EU and NATO, which the Ukrainian leadership took in 1990, 2000, and which the US leadership supported. The afternoon sessions are tasked to begin a new Quest trilogy dedicated to exploring the optimal path to post-war recovery, recognizing that anything less than a solid recovery from the damage done by the Russian-Ukrainian war could end up being the ultimate block to Ukraine eventually becoming a paid-up member of the Euro-Atlantic community. This year's discussions will concentrate on discovering the most suitable sources for financing the building process. Now, how? Very simple. The how of our discussion. Our focus sessions, the featured speakers will get 15 minutes apiece, plus a possible 10 minutes for questions and answers. They're featured speakers, so the question of having questions to featured speakers, we'll see how that works. In the morning session, panel sessions, chairs will have 5 to 6 minutes overview. The panelists will have 12 to 14 minutes apiece. The special commentators, 8 to 10 minutes apiece. The question and answer section will run for 10 to 15 minutes. Now, in the afternoon, the panel sessions, we'll get to that in the afternoon. Now, swiftly on to our opening remarks session. I've already mentioned the names of our 2 presenters in this session, both iconic figures in the contemporary global diplomatic community. Minister Boris Tarashuk is essentially the father of modern, truly post-Soviet Ukrainian diplomacy. Twice foreign minister of Ukraine during the Yushchenko prime ministership and during Yushchenko's presidency, elected to Rada, served at one point as the chair of the Rada Committee on Euro Integration, a big supporter of our first Quest roundtable as foreign minister, and a key participant in the event, presently Ukraine's permanent representative to the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. And beside him is Ambassador Dan Fried, having served as an envoy to Poland at a critical time of its post-Warsaw Pact development and in various influential positions in both Department of State and in the National Security Council. He is considered widely the diplomatic architect of NATO's successful expansion east into Eastern Europe. He was a big supporter of our first roundtable and a key participant in that gathering. I welcome both of you because I think that we've done in the last 25 years. So with that, I think Minister Tarashuk, you may want to use the podium. Yes? Yes? Okay, then I invite you to come and say your word at the podium. Chris, can you help?
Thank you, Walter. Dear friends, indeed, as Walter said, I was at the beginning of this series of 25 roundtables, participating in the first one and subsequent. It is a real pleasure for me to be again here and to see my good friends whom we cooperated very closely on the development of Ukrainian-US relationship. And this is obviously Ambassador Dan Fried, John Herbst, Anders Asland, and many, many other friends who are not present here with us, but whom I'm very grateful for the cooperation. Well, I was entrusted to concentrate on the past of Ukraine's quest for mature nationhood, although I prefer to speak about current and future, but I was not, this time I was not lucky enough to have this task. Now about the subject I was entrusted on. And first of all, I would like to express gratitude to the organizers of this roundtable, in particular to Walter Zaritsky for bringing us together to reflect on Ukraine's journey over the past 25 years. We have taken the mistakes we have made and the successes we have achieved as we navigate the road ahead towards Ukraine's full integration into European community. Today, I will focus on a critical period of our country's history, the decade which embraced the period before the restoration of our external relations during a formative period of Ukraine. Ukraine's struggle for independence spans centuries and has been marked by a perseverance and resilience. This arduous journey culminated on 24th August 1991, when Ukraine declared restoration of its independence, a momentous achievement without bloodshed. A question mark. Was it without the bloodshed? But bloodshed came later, 23 years later, when a stark reminded that our sovereignty and independence is something we must constantly defend and uphold. About the internal developments at this 10 years period. After independence, Ukraine took significant steps to assert its sovereignty and free itself from Moscow's influence. The Declaration of State Sovereignty on 16 July 1990 was a fundamental step in this direction. We introduced our own currency and established the National Bank of Ukraine, signaling economic autonomy. Out of 1 million Soviet military contingent, we formed our armed forces, underlining our commitment to national defense. Despite these efforts, we faced formidable internal challenges. First, on the economic hardships. The transition from a Soviet time-planned economy, market-based system was met with difficulties, including hyperinflation rates that soars to 10,000%. The economic instability affected every facet of society. Soviet nomenclature was another challenge. The remnants of the Soviet bureaucratic system hindered progressive reform and maintained old patterns of governance that were incompatible with our new democratic aspirations. energy dependence. Our reliance on Russian gas and oil made us vulnerable to external pressures and underlined the need for diversified energy sources. Military complexity. The presence of a large contingent of Soviet forces forces on our soil posed security risks and complicated our defense restructuring. Nuclear arsenal. Inheriting the world's third largest nuclear stockpile was both a strategic advantage and a major diplomatic challenge. National identity. Prior to 2014, there was a palpable lack of cohesive Ukrainian national identity, which hindered societal unity and nation-building efforts. What were the major mistakes? And these mistakes were with the geopolitical implications. The Russian fleet and CIS membership. The agreement on a division and subsequent deployment of Russian Black Sea Fleet in Crimea, which I define as a time bomb. And our involvement in the Community of Independent States, CIS, complicated our sovereignty and foreign policy goals. Why was a mistake to agree on the division of Soviet Black Sea Fleet? Because according to the arrangements reached between the newly independent states, all armed forces on the territory of each republic were a part, inseparable part of this state. Unfortunately, the Black Sea Fleet was not within the scope of this definition, and it has to be completely under Ukraine's control, but it was a mistake to agree on the division of this fleet, which subsequently created a real problem and finally to the occupation of the Crimea. Foreign policy milestones at this period, taking our place on the world chessboard, as was defined by Zbigniew Brzezinski. On the international front, Ukraine sought to establish itself as an independent and responsible member of the global community. We adopted 3 non-nuclear principles and non-alliance. Why? Because back July 1990, we sent a signal, our Ukrainian parliament sent a signal to Moscow, first of all, that we are not going to be a part of the Soviet Union and its legacy, that we are different from the Soviet Union. And that's why we announced the non-nuclear principles and policy of non-alignment, meaning that we cease to be a part of the Soviet system. Ukraine pursued from the very beginning independent foreign policy, distancing ourselves from Moscow. What were the key achievements during this period? Among them, nuclear disarmament. We began negotiations on our nuclear arsenal and eventually joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state. The 1994 Budapest Memorandum on National Security guarantees, in English it is assurances, in Ukrainian and Russian it was guarantees, provided security assurances, and by 1996 we had completed the disarmament process. And I wonder, the audience, was it a mistake or not? Was it right to do? Taking into account current realities, we are waging the war, full-fledged war with nuclear power, permanent member of the Security Council, Russia. In Ukraine, by the way, we have a discussion during these recent days and months about the possibility of returning to the nuclear power status, but it is impossible to return to where you were not a part of. Ukraine never was a nuclear power, so you cannot return to the status of nuclear power. Partnership for Peace. Ukraine was the first CIS country to join NATO's Partnership for Peace program, signaling our commitment to Euro-Atlantic integration. Peacekeeping contributions. Our participation in the stabilization forces in Bosnia and Herzegovina, S4, the Kosovo Force, K4, and peacekeeping mission in Eastern Slavonia underscored our role as a contributor to the international security. A Euro-Atlantic integration. We set a clear course for European Union and NATO membership, aligning our policies with Western democratic values. Strategic partnerships. Establishing a strategic partnership with the United States strengthened our international standing and provided avenues for support and cooperation. And finally, the regional influence. Ukraine began to assert itself regionally through involvement in the initiatives such as resolution of the Transnistria conflict and participation in Guam, that is Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Moldova, promoting security and cooperation in the regions. So we faced on this way difficult challenges like nuclear negotiations. We faced a territorial threat from the very beginning from Russia and one other neighboring state. About the CIS dynamics, Russia attempts to reassert its dominance of the former Soviet states through CIS frame required us to navigate carefully to maintain our independence and pursue our chosen path. At the conclusion, let me say a few words that it was a very difficult journey for Ukraine during the first decade of our independence. With our achievements and setbacks, with mistakes and challenges. But it was a preparation for the future strong Ukrainian state. And we hope that this period we are facing, Ukrainians, a period of Russian full-fledged aggression, help us to further consolidate Ukrainian state, Ukrainian nationhood, and we rely on our allies and first of all the United States of America for consistent help and assistance until the end of this war, with Ukraine regaining control over the occupied territories and our allies helping in this. I thank you very much, and Slava Ukraini.
Now, I would ask Ambassador Fried to address the audience.
Well, it is my honor to follow Boris Tarasyuk, an old friend from earlier phases of Ukraine's independence, and it's a pleasure to be here with John Herbst and Anders Osland and others online. Minister Tarasyuk is right in extolling the virtues of Ukraine's first decade of independence. We forget that it wasn't easy. And I want to give a parallel sense of the US evolution during the same period. Sitting here, and especially the younger people, we take for granted Ukrainian independence, but this was not at all assumed to be a realistic possibility up to and including 1990 and 91. It was regarded as an article of faith throughout the West that the Soviet Union was forever, one way or another, and that the Iron Curtain, the division of Europe, the continuation of Yalta Europe was more or less permanent, a fact of life. The United States was not really prepared for the magnitude of the upheavals in 1989 in Central and Eastern Europe, and even after that, we were not prepared for the breakup of the Soviet Union. We lacked imagination. Understandably, it is hard to predict radical disruptions. I know because I was in 1989 the Polish desk officer and suggested that big things might be happening in Poland, and I was regarded as a slightly mad extremist. So Ukrainian independence was regarded by the United States as something difficult and unknown. The Soviet experts in the US foreign policy establishment had studied Soviet history through a prism of Russian history written by Russian nationalist historians, largely in third-tier areas of interest, which explains why it was so difficult for the US establishment to understand Ukraine's alt-European aspirations. And I want to be quite blunt about this. Why did Neville Chamberlain regard Czechoslovakia as expendable? And that's in 1938. And that's because Neville Chamberlain grew up with maps of Europe that didn't include Czechoslovakia. The map he grew up with included Austria-Hungary and the Russian Empire, no Poland, but a common Russian Empire-German border. That's what he grew up with. That's what he thought was normal, right? Napoleon used to say that if you want to understand somebody, understand the world that existed when they were 20. Okay. So to Neville Chamberlain, Czechoslovakia was ridiculous, right? How is this a country? He never heard of it when he was growing up. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on the Americans, but it took a big mental step to understand that Ukraine really is a country. And it took a big mental step for Americans to go back and look at the history of Central and Eastern Europe, not through a prism of Russia. It was especially hard because the Ukrainians themselves, as Boris has referred to, hadn't a clear idea of their own national identity or where they belonged in the world. Yes, independent from the Soviet Union, that's true. That was determined, but there was no great desire on the part of Ukrainians to integrate with the West or NATO. That non-alignment was seen as protection against reintegration with Russia. In other words, non-alignment was a progressive step in the old world use of the term progressive. And the Americans were completely, in the early 90s, we were completely unready to consider NATO enlargement even to Poland. That took a struggle. The idea of Ukraine in NATO was regarded as mad, simply unthinkable, but the Ukrainians were also not pushing for it. This required a generation of Ukrainians born in an independent country who realized that a European future was really what they wanted and, in fact, the only safety for them. I don't mean to be too hard on the Americans. We did, after a period of several years of internal struggle, decide that we would not extend a divided Europe into the post-Cold War era. We decided to support NATO enlargement, President Clinton did that with a lot of Republican help. Then President Bush, with a lot of Democratic Party help, extended NATO enlargement to the Baltics. Two American leaders, very different politically, came to the same strategic conclusions. But this window of opportunity was closing rapidly after 2000. The external circumstances of a NATO enlargement, of Poland's integration with Europe, were far more favorable in the 90s because Russia was weaker and Russian nationalism had not returned. It was latent, it was potential. The Poles, the Czechs, a better class of Hungarians warned us that it might be back, as did some Ukrainians at the time. But looking back, it's hard to imagine circumstances under which we could have taken Ukraine into an expanding NATO in the 90s. We weren't ready, the Ukrainians weren't ready. But the issues that we were dealing with in the late 80s and the early 90s are the same issues we're dealing with today. The issues of the breakup of the Russian Empire and what will replace it. This is not a hard one to figure out. Ukraine wants to be a country with Europe. Russia wants its empire back and is willing to kill lots of people to get it back. Or they're willing to engage in subterfuge and pressure as they are in Georgia and as they are in Moldova. The circumstances are not great, but Ukraine has come a tremendous distance. And as we speak, and I think, as you may hear, and if you don't hear from Mike Carpenter, you should certainly ask him. At least the Biden administration and some significant parts of the Republican Party, even under Trump, are coming to the conclusion that indeed Ukraine is a European country and belongs in Europe. So, summing up the 90s and the first decade, the Ukrainians did a lot, starting from a difficult base. The Soviet Union was no joke. The repression was serious. It was of a level far greater than in Poland in the 1980s. They did okay. We made mistakes. The Budapest Memorandum maybe being one of them. But I don't want to be too hard on our predecessors. We were dealing with difficult circumstances that we hadn't anticipated. And we're still alive, and Ukraine's future is still open. And Ukraine and we have the possibility to build on what we achieved and not be prisoners of our past failings. And we do have choices and we do have agency, and that's why we're all here. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion. And yes, Slava Ukraini.
Thank you, Greg. Because I usually don't want to do this, but if I would actually ask a question of my own, I believe, rather than doing to the audience, because I think that we would open up for too much of a discussion of time constraint. I would just very quickly, with both of you, ask a question. Since the Ukrainians, and you both there, the veterans are here on this. Dr. Austin is here, John Herbst, Professor Herbst is here, Steve Blank, Herman Birchner, there's so many, Louis Maidonic, the leadership program. In front of all of you, just very quickly, if you could say what you think was the most important thing that the Ukrainians did to show that they're on the Euro-Atlantic and in the last 25 years, and what was the least successful thing they did in showing that they're on the Euro-Atlantic? If that could be done in a sentence or two. On this. On the last one.
Well, as a participant of the formation of the fundamentals of Ukraine's foreign policy, I dare to say that for us in the foreign ministry, there was no doubt as to where Ukraine is going to. At the beginning of 90s, we clearly defined our objective as joining the Euro-Atlantic community, meaning NATO and the European Union. So what was the major mistake? Well, this was the remnants of the Soviet legacy in a wider Ukrainian governing bodies. And this was the major challenge, even after 33 years of independence, I dare to say that we have coped with this challenge, and now Ukraine is much more mature as a nation, independent nation, as it used to be at the beginning of 90s. Thank you.
I'll answer the question in similar fashion. The biggest failure was not to push faster with reforms and national transformation, but easier said than done, okay? The Ukrainian governments in the 90s did not have the political capital that the Polish government had in the early 90s to radically transform the economy. They didn't have it. So, you know, that was a lost opportunity, but for God's sakes, it's easy for me to say. The situation, the Ukrainians had tougher choices. The thing that the Ukrainians did right was over time develop a civil society which was deeply committed to democracy and European values. And the symbol of that are the Ukrainians in the Maidan flying the EU flag, which meant for them, you know, to use the contemporary American political phrase, we're not going back. We are going forward to a democratic Europe, and Ukraine is a free country in that democratic Europe. It was a civilizational choice, and it was deeply felt and broader. And Zbig Brzezinski started saying this around the time of the Orange Revolution. Ukrainian national identity in its current form is crystallizing in a multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-religious form, which is remarkable. That is the nation and Ukrainian patriotism linked with universal democratic values is powerful, and that's what you see in Ukraine today. Despite all the problems and the oligarchs and the corruption, yeah, I get all that, but there's something more that's happening, and that is powerful and important, and that will in the end save Ukraine.
Very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Yes, Andres, please.
You have a mic?
Yes. I will allow that.
It should be on the thing. It should be on the thing.
It's
The
fine.
next
Yeah, I can go out. Yeah. Quickly, thank you very much for excellent presentation. I was particularly struck by one thing that Ambassador Tarasuk said, that the 1997 agreement on the Black Sea Fleet was a time bomb. And 97, that was the best relationship between Russia and Ukraine ever. With the friendship agreement, bilateral, and the agreement on Sevastopol and on the Black Sea Fleet, and also investment agreement. And Yeltsin was alive and awake, and had a very good relationship then with President Kuchma. My question is simple. what else could have been done? What was really possible at that time? I think it was very good formulation. We had that this agreement was a time bomb, but that was not understood at the time. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anders, for your question. I already touched upon this issue that it was contrary to the basic agreements upon the disruption of the former Soviet Union that the Black Sea Fleet should not be the subject of division because it was not a strategic, so to say, weapons or strategic unit as it used to be the nuclear weapons. So the status of the Black Sea Fleet was absolutely different, and it had to belong fully to Ukraine, taking into account the arrangements reached by the newly independent states. Well, you mentioned that together with the Black Sea Fleet Division Agreement, the issue of the Friendship Treaty with Russia. So was it a coincidence? No, it was two connecting, so to say, concessions. Ukraine will receive recognition by Russia of its borders, which were put on down from the very beginning by Moscow. And in exchange, Russia will receive the agreement on the stay, though temporarily stay, of Russian Black Sea Fleet in Ukrainian Sebastopol. So this was a kind of deal where each side received what they seeked for. I don't think that the mistake was done much earlier. The mistake was done back in 1991 when Ukrainian president, then president, agreed on the division of the Black Sea Fleet. So this was a strategic mistake. But later, taking into account this motivation, it was unavoidable to have an agreement on the presence of Russian fleet on Ukrainian territory, which, as I referred to, was a time bomb, which exploded finally. And I think that the mistake of 91 led to a serious problems of 2014 and 2022. What was the negotiable? This was the term of stay of Russian fleet on Ukraine's territory. As a head of Ukrainian delegation on negotiations over the Black Sea Fleet, I was strongly favoring a shorter possible period of Russian Black Sea Fleet stay on Ukrainian territory. My position was 5 years, no more. Why 5 years? Because it became known from Russian admirals that they will be ready to substitute the naval base in Sebastopol to a naval base in Russia, and it might take place under Novorossiysk, some 5 years. So that's why we were keeping this position. But Russians, as then head of Russian delegation, Deepening, told me, their intention was to have a right of basing the Russian fleet for 99 years. Finally, it was agreed to have a 20 years period of stay of Russian fleet on Ukrainian territory, which to my mind was a mistake. But at that time, I was no longer head of the delegation. Thank you.
Nicola, I would ask, because we have a time measurement at this point. I'm afraid, okay, we'll do that one last question. We really are.
Okay, this is a question to both our esteemed guests. Ambassador Fried, you brought up the idea that in 1991, a lot of people question whether Ukraine really exists. And my question is, if we speed up the tape to 2022 and now, do you think that prejudice, do both of you think that prejudice still exists in governmental circles, and this would be manifested back in 2022 when the invasion started? A lot of people in Western capitals felt that Ukraine is going to last a few days or a few weeks. Meanwhile, it's over 900 days and close to 1,000 days right now. And now you have people who are running for president or vice president, and other people saying, Ukraine should give up land for peace. And do you think this prejudice that Ukraine doesn't really exist, and it's not really a really country, still exists today on high levels?
The answer is no, but there is widespread recognition that Ukraine exists. That's no longer the problem. The problem is whether the United States has a core interest in an independent Ukraine or doesn't. And this debate is not confined to just the Trump world and the that part of the Republican Party. You were implicit, I'm being explicit, a week out from the elections. During the Obama administration in 2014, the Obama NSC was divided about whether the United States had core interests in Ukraine. Okay, this was Obama. I was in government, I know that debate. The Republican Party is similarly divided. It's not between people who don't regard Ukraine as a country, everybody does. The question is whether Russia has a sphere of influence that includes Ukraine and whether we ought to recognize it. And that is also a tradition in American diplomacy. It's not a very good one. I'm not proud of it. But that is the issue. Whether or not it is in the US interest to recognize a Russian sphere of influence. And both Democrats and Republicans, left and right, have been, look, I don't like that view, okay? But Democrats and Republicans at different times have been guilty of such thinking. Kissinger and Nixon were ready to assign Eastern Europe to the Soviet sphere of domination forever as the price of détente. The left was willing to do the same, okay, at different times. Reagan was not, and Clinton, after thinking about it, decided, no, I'm for a Europe whole, free and peace. So it's not a left-right division. There are divisions on the left and the right as to whether Ukraine, whether American interests mean, whether we have a compelling interest in a Europe whole, free and peace that includes Ukraine, or whether we are ultimately willing to recognize a Russian sphere of domination, which Russian style means through bloodshed. And that is a debate. And that is being debated in our presidential campaign. No matter who wins, that debate will continue. And as I said, there are Republicans and Democrats on the right and wrong sides of that issue. The good news is we've made progress. The bad news is not enough. But certainly the Biden people are way ahead of the divided Obama administration. And there are many Republicans who believe in supporting Ukraine for the right reasons. So game on.
I would actually, this is such a delightful session and so many delightful questions that I would have continued this, but we really do have to complete it. I'd like to a round of applause for our two speakers because they're really nice and totally for our process. I thank both of them for having taken part in this. We now move on to our second session, or our first plenary session, and Andrei, you have to confirm to me because I realized that we may have casualties. And so if you can tell me how it is.
You have your moderator here.
Yes,
You have David online.
David is online,
You have Irena online.
right, and we have
Stephen
Louis.
is out as far as we know.
Yes, it's Louis is here.
Okay,
So,
Louis is here, and
So-
I haven't heard from Kyle today.
yeah, that's what I'm worried about, Kyle.
And Keith,
Gene, I'm gonna be phoning right now because I think he's on the way, but he hasn't made it yet. Ambassador Herbst. I think that what you're going to have is Louis, if you can come up. I'm going to make a couple of changes on that first session. I'll very quickly explain. In terms of time factors, it turns out that that may aid us. We are going to have Ambassador Herbst leading a session precisely on three very important questions. In the last 25 years, how much progress has been made in terms of the Euro-Atlantic ambitions that Ukraine has in three categories, which is category of robust democracy or increasingly robust democracy, increasing social cohesion, and an established and yet tolerant national identity. And so with that, what we will have is a panel which would have had 5 members, but at this point, Steve Nix is trapped somewhere between Georgia and Moldova as things are changing. Kyle Parker has just come back from Georgia and had told us last night that he might not be able to make it. We're hoping to get him online. We have Dave Kramer, former Assistant Secretary Kramer online, and we have Miss Irina online. So Ambassador Herbst, with 2 of those casualties, possibly Gene, I've got to find out. He's supposed to be on his way, but I got to find out where he is. I'm just going to let you open up the session. Dave is here. Irina is here in Ukraine. So, and Louis is here with us as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We had a great discussion already. I hope we continue that here. And I'll let my colleague David Kramer, who's not in person, who will so right now, I'll do it virtually. I can't hear.
make sure, so long as you, yeah.
This is working. Well,
Yeah.
let's get David here.
Yeah, I just changed my mic, let's see.
David, can you hear me? Good.
Okay.
Good, you missed my insults, and we'll keep it up. All right. David, we'll give you the first opportunity to speak, and then we'll turn to Louis. And if Gene gets here, we'll turn to Gene. Please, over to you. By the way, excellent piece in foreign policy.
Thanks very much, John. And sorry your team is down 3 games to none, but hope lives eternally. So first, Walter, thank you for including me and thank you for accommodating me here from Dallas. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes, you can, loud and clear.
Great, thanks. I would start this discussion, and I hope it really will be, and I'll try to be very brief here, by saying that I think there is criticism of Ukraine's democratic development since the full-scale invasion was launched. Some of that is warranted. Some of it, I think, is grossly unfair. Ukraine is under attack. It has been since 2014, and it accelerated since February 24th of 2022. And so for a country that is under relentless assault from Russian forces, from Putin's forces, I do think Ukraine is entitled to be cut some slack. That is not to say that President Zelensky and the government should be allowed to get away with any misbehavior at all. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I am suggesting that Ukraine may be headed that is simply not realistic under the current circumstances. I think it's also important to remember, then this is obviously a well-informed crowd, that Ukraine's civil society and media have been vital parts of Ukraine's success and progress over the decades. And it is critically important that those institutions remain protected from any government pressure, interference from outside, whatever the case may be. It is also true that over the decades, corruption has been Ukraine's biggest Achilles heel. It has created openings for Russia to exploit. And it's incredibly important that Ukraine continue the progress that I think has been made over the past few years in particular in fighting corruption, that Ukraine will help defend itself internally from enemies and from external enemies as well. And you see a number of resignations. Just recently, the Prosecutor General's resignation. You've seen resignations of other officials. You see investigations of officials and members of parliament. You see arrests being made. One of the things that I think is striking is that we are seeing and reading more instances of this in the fight against corruption than we have in the past, because both the Ukrainian media are unafraid to report on things and to investigate allegations of corruption, and the government is doing more to hold people to account than it has in the past. Perfect? No. Again, but Ukraine is at war, not by its own choosing. And so I think it is important to recognize the progress that Ukraine has made over these years, and not to let up, but to keep up the pressure. There has been some criticism in certain circles, largely parroting Kremlin propaganda, that Ukraine has an illegitimate government because it hasn't held elections since 2019 for president. This, of course, would be a violation of Ukrainian law if elections were conducted because of martial law that had been declared as a result of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. That's why elections have not been held. And President Zelensky has made it clear that as soon as the martial law is lifted, which hopefully means the war is ended, that elections would resume. But it is, I think, not only unfair, but unfounded for people to criticize the lack of elections in Ukraine at a time when it is under relentless assault and attack from Russian forces. There are so many questions about how one would be able to conduct an election in the current circumstances, to enable people to vote who fled the country, to enable people to vote who have been internally displaced, and to enable people to vote who are under Russian occupation and control. To me, those are issues that people overlook when they want to find reasons to criticize Ukraine and hold it up to an unfair standard. Two other things, and then I'll finish, John. One is the national identity, I think, was also mentioned by Walter and listed in the panel description. I think one of the main sources of national identity originated, of course, in the Orange Revolution of 2004. Then it really picked up in 2014, and then it really accelerated in 2022. And in 2004, there was, of course, the effort by the pro-Russian Prime Minister Yanukovych to steal the election, but it was also Russian interference in the election, with Putin standing with Yanukovych and expressing clear Russian support for his candidacy. And then, of course, in 2014 and 2022, I don't need to tell this audience that the national unity was reinforced and solidified as a result of Putin's invasions in both cases. It shouldn't be a shock that a country's national identity rises when it is invaded unjustly, unprovoked, as Putin has done in the case of Ukraine. So that leads me to the last point, which is I think some people also talk about the legacy of the Soviet Union. We're now 33 years since the breakup of the Soviet Union. It's time to stop talking about that. It's time to stop using the term post-Soviet, as some do, and it's time to talk about Ukraine as a full, vibrant, independent state. And that, of course, is one of the main reasons Putin invaded Ukraine. He does not want to see Ukraine as a vibrant democratic state that is moving toward the West. He views that as a threat to his own rotten, corrupt, authoritarian control over Russia. And he wants to do everything he can to try to undermine Ukraine obviously he doesn't recognize it as an independent state. He's made those comments numerous times going back as far as 2008 with President Bush, if not sooner or earlier. And but it's this independence and effort to move in a democratic direction, to deal with the problem of corruption, and to try to integrate with the Euro-Atlantic community. All of those things solidify Ukraine's national identity that Putin views as a threat. And I think that's one of the driving factors behind his decision to launch the full-scale invasion in 2022. So, John, let me stop there, and happy to yield the floor to you and others. Thanks.
David, that was terrific, thank you. Louis? Sure, everybody, I'm Louis Medatic, it's the Congressional Office for International Leadership. I'm David Kramer. That would be an awesome thing, and I'm also awestruck by the first two speakers, the profound background they've provided us, kind of setting the scene, as well as being here with Ambassador Herbst, who delight. I've worked with many years. I used to run into in Kiev when I lived there quite often. Just to answer Walter's question about the most important that I see, and I see kind of the merge between the Orange Revolution and the Maidan. I love talking about the Maidan because it serves as my last name, Maidanic. So,
when we got to Ellis Island, we said, "U Maidana, u synagoga," or something of that nature.
Did what Don Corleone did.
Huh?
Did what Don Corleone did.
Yeah, so became the center. So, and the least I would say, and also the fight against corruption, as you've just alluded to, how successful that's been. So it's kind of a merged civil society and fighting against these things that draw criticism. I would say the least important and the worst thing that happened was the events leading up to Yanukovych's presidency, the fact that Timoshenko and Poroshenko couldn't get together, East and West was divided. Thank God Russia brought them all together. Not thank God, that's a horrible phrase. Unfortunately, Russia brought them together. Covering some of the slack as a smaller panel, I kind of wanted to set the context for my review of the three issues Walter laid out. So I have, Ukraine has recaptured somewhat about in the range of 50% of the land that maybe Russia had, when you look at the whole thing, had taken over. Maybe 20% is still occupied of Ukraine. I don't know if that includes Crimea, but I've heard up to 30% of population maybe. There's been 300 billion in aid, 80 billion from the US, 30,000 casualties of civilians, 3.7 million IDPs, 6.5 million fled, and maybe 14.6 million seeking humanitarian assistance. The atrocities, the Russian atrocities, can't even be quantified. The stealing of children, the horrific things that we've seen. But on the positive side, throughout this horrendous war, economic growth is positive, impressively positive, and fighting corruption has been a golden mark. And whenever I bring MPs to Congress or people from Come Back Alive, and they show how every bullet is accounted for, this is good stuff. So first to open, I would say I want to scream fire. What we saw in Moldova, ambiguous. What we saw in Georgia is truly frightening, contested. This shows the importance of Ukraine at this time. And I apologize, that's a little bit off topic, but we have this kind of emphasized the importance of Walter, the work you do and what we're doing here today, and recognizing the incredible progress Ukraine has made. My program, the Open World program, since 2003, we've hosted 4,500 Ukrainians, more than that. Since 2014, it's our largest program. More than 2,000 people have come from Ukraine. More than 450, about 20% of them veterans and polytrauma. It's a big program we're doing. Others have been MPs, political leaders, civil society leaders, those fighting disinformation, and those fighting war crimes. Now I'll get to the subject. I had a little extra time, Walter, so I took advantage of it. Robust democratic politics. How to answer this in a time of war. Of course, you had mentioned quite a few of the substance. In a period of time of martial war, no elections are supported by the Constitution. There's a civil general consensus. You're absolutely correct. Having elections with Russians occupying 30% or 30% of the population, IDPs, and it's just It's clearly Russian propaganda, and I would say pure BS. Many of the MPs, and when I was in Kiev, when it was a really big issue a couple of months ago, no, about a year ago, and it was really the big issue of the day. Any MP that I spoke to, or any person that I took seriously, said we can't possibly have elections. This is not a strike against our democracy. It's effective Russian propaganda during the war. So, there have been some conflicts. They've been unified on this, but all the MPs that I speak to that come and visit Congress with me, they say there are no more parties anymore. We have one aim: victory. There are conflicts. There's conflicts over service and who could serve and when they should serve, and also conflicts over taxes on oil, energy policy. So they're a robust community during a time of freaking war. Lights are on, the bars are going on. Some days there's 7 hours without electricity. So I would say the robust amount, it's there, it's ready to go. Social cohesion, more enduring social cohesion, that's unequivocal. It's evident in the people helping people, the amount of humanitarian organizations that have been formed, the revolting against Russian atrocities and the stealing of children, the umbrage and the hostility that has caused. I would say there's still old hostilities exist, rivalries exists. How do you create a Ministry of Veterans Affairs when the Ministry of Health has been doing this? It's a war against a population. And one major positive is so many of the Ukrainians I meet with now fighting atrocities, war crimes. They're sophisticated. They've been to the US on muskie programs. Their English is sharp. They understand it's not that blank stare you used to get when you ask about serious matters. They're on the same page. They're moving forward. They want to be part of Europe. Undoubtedly, the social cohesion is there. And once again, the Tymoshenko and Yushchenko, the battle of East and West, I think, has been solved once and for all. And final, national identity. That's kind of, I think, the most forwarded by the war. Ukraine learned its lessons of divisiveness. They proudly recount, any Ukrainian, them with how their history has been completely hijacked by the Russians, and the history books will be rewritten one day. The issue of nationalist and fascist has ceased, especially when you look at the brown boots of Russia. And the Russian conduct of the war. Anytime that I meet with Ukrainian generals or Ukrainian about atrocities, they talk about how their generals, their military men are trained on the laws of war, and they respect the laws of war. Yeah, there's some battle stuff going on, but I think there's a black and white context here. And to kind of summarize, I see progress in all three of these areas, great progress. And once victory is attained, I think Ukraine is in a perfect position. One of the biggest risks I could see is, Russians being able to use their energy profits and the disgusting amount of money that's going into Russian coffers from going around the sanctions. And I would also say Ukraine, going back to the previous one on national identity, I think there's also a consensus that there will be no compromise on borders and giving up land as part of any negotiations. You don't reward aggression. I hope that policy sticks. On those, and now we're going back to everyone that has spoken, has said, and this goes to the national identity. Everyone ends their statements with Slava Ukrainia, and the response is Heroyam Slava. And for 25 years, Walter, or 21, I've been coming to these. I always wanted to add next year in Yalta as a Jew, but it's not gaining traction. So any help you can give me out in the field, we had next year in Yalta. Okay. And on that positive note, I'll say, I hope to see some of you tonight at Okean Elzy at the Anthem, right down the block from my house. Please join. And on November 6th, we're having a large group of polytrauma specialists come to DC. Also, Kid Save is sponsoring a group serving children at war. And we have a group of battlefield injury specialists going to University of Nebraska Medical Center. And we'll have an event at Ukraine House in the evening of November 6th. somewhat of an open invite. Walter knows how to get me. I'm pretty easy to find around DC. We'd love to have you join us. It'll be 12, 18, 24 Ukrainians total, and me too. So please join, and it's a pleasure to be part of this incredible forum. Thank you for having me, Walter. Thank you.
It's a very impressive use of your time to make an advertisement. Congratulations.
I'd have to, right? I'm using the mornings. So.
Walter, any word on Gene, the estimable Gene Fisher? Okay.
Hey, John,
Yes?
can you address the issues yourself? I mean, you've been there so many times and such an expert. I mean, it would be good to hear from you and not just for you to ask questions.
You anticipated my next move. I was gonna say how I learned a long time ago to be ready to move in fast changing circumstances. But wait, we have actually, I guess I'll speak now. We have the commentator supposed to speak after the panel. Correct, Walter? Okay, fine. No, David, I was gonna propose doing just what you've suggested. But I'll be brief. But is she, okay, that's fine, but I thought she was a commentator. Right, I know, okay, let's do that. Okay, Unita, why don't you speak and then I will jump in if necessary. Yeah. Okay, please, over to you. I'm not sure she heard me. Unita, can you hear me? No.
Hi,
Are we in touch now?
do you hear me? Yeah,
Yes, good. Since Gene Fishel's not here, we're gonna turn to you next.
okay.
So please, your comments on the statements thus far. Over to you, please.
Okay, thank you. Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you for opportunity to share a few of my thoughts at this conference. I split it for two parts. Part one is democratic politics. Ukraine opted for the democratic vector right in 1991. Firstly, these were the requirements of the mass Ruch movement, which was first called for perestroika and then raised its political demands and became the People's Movement of Ukraine. Secondly, the vote of the Act of Independence took place in the parliament amid a heated but civilized debate between the active democratic opposition and the confused community majority. One of the key arguments was the mass actions to support of the independence of Ukraine on the Kyiv streets and the whole of the Ukraine. Thirdly, on December 1, 1991, more than 84% of the population of Ukraine participated in the all-Ukrainian referendum for independence. More than 90% supported the Act of Independence. Fourthly, the elections in Ukraine are free and fair. At times, when the attempts to falsify election could affect the results, Ukrainians defended their right to free choice on the Maidan. For example, 2004 Orange Revolution. Ukraine immediately chose a pro-Western course, having agreed to get rid of nuclear weapons. The Ukrainians believed in the security guarantees of the Budapest Memorandum provided by Britain, the USA, and Russia. However, almost 3 decades passed from the Partnership for Peace of 1994 to the submission of the accelerated application for accession in 2022. It does not mean what Ukrainians did not want to be in alliance. It also does mean what they were not wanted there. The Western policy prioritized Russia, and being in the zone of interest that affects the mood of Ukrainians. For example, President Yushchenko called the 2008 refusal to accept the application to the NATO humiliating. Pro-European sentiment was strong, especially among the youth, on whom Russian propaganda had little influence. The younger generation identified themselves as Europeans, but they were locked within the borders of the country by the Visa Iron Curtain by 2017. Let me remind what at this year's traveling to Russia was easy and open, and Moscow, which is quite closest even for Russians, already in 2000s, simplified the conditions to stay in this city for Ukrainians, offering them preferences in work, healthcare, and education. As of 2013 survey, 70% of Ukrainians have never left their regions. However, in the first 2 years of visa-free EU regime, 2017-2019, over 42 million trips to the EU were made. It took the EU 4 years, European Union, 4 years from the revolution and beginning of Russia aggression to make this decision. Part 2, national identity and social cohesion. I decided to combine these two issues since I consider them interrelated, and I will explain why. First, from proclamation to restoration. This is how the way of national becoming of the post-Soviet nation can be characterized. Let me remind what in 1991, the Act of Independence, due to compromise with communists, the word restoration was deleted, literally, being replaced with proclamation. No earlier than 2015, as part of the communization, the Ukrainian parliament confirmed the following of the state tradition from 1917, the creation of Ukrainian Ukrainian People's Republic. Since then, the proclamation practically disappears in the narrative and public communication. This belief is strongly supported by a high interest in history among Ukrainians as a result of the start and brutal development of the war. This interest is naturally based on the desire to know oneself and the enemy in order to win. Until 2014, Ukrainians did not believe in Russian aggression. And until 2022, it was hard to imagine genocide in the middle of Europe in the 21st century. It's only the Ukrainians were blind. First, even with a generally low interest in the past, in conversation about geopolitical choices, Ukrainians think not only economic dreams, but also the issues of democracy and security were the key ones. We saw where Russian society and the main part of the former Soviet Republic were forwarding. So Ukrainian civil and political activities chose the vector like a Poland over the Baltic states. However, the collective West did not seek to rethink Ukrainian history as well. Even after unprecedented opening of KGB archives of 2008 and the decommunization of 2015. Unfortunately, what seems were only new genocide, the discovery of crimes in Bucha and later Izium, the massive bombing of peaceful cities would force the Western academy, media, and governments to recognize the Holodomor as a genocide. The Western factors what made the decision misjudge about both the Russian aggression and the Ukrainian resistance. This had a crucial influence on the support of Ukraine, especially when it comes to the supply of weapons. Instead, Ukrainians demonstrated an extraordinary example of strong resistance and equally strong civilian support for the army and refugees. Namely, this is about a massive volunteer movement. Democracy, economic freedom, and national memory contribute to social cohesion, opposite the totalitarian policies of USSR. Sociology of 2022 records that 58% of population of the West and Central Ukraine participate in volunteering. You know what East Ukraine is under war. 81% of citizens donated money to armed forces. 63% donated clothes of other items to the refugees. 60% donated money to humanitarian needs. 54% gave shelter or assistance to the refugees. The phenomenon of mass volunteerism is not the new in Ukrainian history. The struggles for independence in the past periods was based on the massive support of the population. Unfortunately, in Western academia, following the thesis of Russia propaganda, these periods of history are still stigmatized and practically not studied. For example, the book by Dr. Vetrovich and Professor Lutsuk with translation of Nazi and Soviet documents about the OUN and the UPA was at first recognized by the Ukrainian Library Association as one of the best materials important as a source for universities. But a year later, after just one article by a pro-Russian author, they deleted it from the list. But this book is about making the sources accessible to Western scholars in English, which is especially important when trips to Kyiv archives are quite difficult today. Meanwhile, fundamental change in identity are taking place in Ukraine. Since 2014, new and non-Soviet forms of commemoration of the Second World War have been introduced. For the first time, historical events that are key for national minorities included in a common national narrative through the formation of a state calendar of public holidays and memorable dates. The Holocaust, the genocide of Gypsy, the deportation of Crimean Tatars, the mass deportation of Polish, Greek, and other minorities committed by both the Nazi and communist regimes have become memorable points that unite the political Ukrainian nation. More than 77 and 66% respectively support renaming communist and rational names. In addition, according to the latest survey published a few days ago, 55% of Ukrainians believe that Ukraine was a colony of Russian Empire. This indicates that decolonization is an important part of the reinterpretation of national history. Thank you for the great pleasure and the opportunity to share these thoughts with the audience. My thanks to American people for the military aid to Ukraine and the Ukrainians of USA for active culture diplomacy. And finally, my gratitude to Armed Forces of Ukraine for my opportunity to speak from my home, the liberated town of Worzel, which is part of community of the city of Bucha. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. All right, I'm going to take David's suggestion, which Walter has endorsed, and also address the three themes for the session, and then we'll open it up to some questions. The first thing that needs to be understood is that Ukraine entered its independence period with a substantially engaged citizenry. Ukrainian civic organizations were active in the last decade of the Soviet Union, and they were a principal reason. And the activism which characterized Ukrainian society was an important reason why Ukraine has demonstrated a clear but not always direct commitment to democracy and to establishing an open society since the first days of independence. And we all know that Ukraine has had largely democratic presidential elections since the very beginning, evident in the fact that the first president of Ukraine, Kravchuk, lost his re-election to Kuchma. And whatever our criticism of the Kuchma presidency, he did oversee an election which his side lost. And the reason why the Orange Revolution was successful is because ultimately the forces of repression in Ukraine were unwilling to crack down on the Yushchenko supporters during the Orange Revolution. And of course, Yushchenko's commitment to democracy was evident in the fact that Yanukovych won. And so on and so forth down to this day. There has been, as David Kramer pointed out, some very unjust and not just politically motivated in the worst sense, but you might say aggressively motivated in the very worst sense, meaning coming from Russia, characterization of the absence of a presidential election since Moscow's big invasion. I will repeat David's essential points because they are so important, which is that the international election authorities, as in IFES, as in ODIHR, the political class in Ukraine across the spectrum, meaning both the government and the opposition parties, understand that conducting a presidential election with a substantial part of your territory occupied by a truly nasty imperial power is simply not possible. And the bad faith and ignorant critics of Ukraine in the West fail to understand, for example, that during the American Civil War, habeas corpus was suspended by the truly great American statesman, President Abraham Lincoln. The second point that's essential to talk about here relates to, I would say, the combination of democratic practices in Ukraine and, second topic of this conversation, enduring social cohesion. We have seen a truly magnificent rally of Ukrainian public spirit and political wisdom. And normally that phrase, political wisdom, is not applied to Ukraine, demonstrating an inadequacy of Western analyses of the country and its people. Under a truly existential threat, existential is a phrase which is tossed around promiscuously, but existential is certainly a very real description of the circumstances an independent, proudly Ukrainian people face in the face of an imperial aggressor who considers war crimes to be the proper way to conduct an invasion. If Ukraine loses this war, the Ukrainian people will be subjected to an imperial boot that will make Russian past crimes in Ukraine, with the important exception, of course, of the Holodomor, seem tame. Because the stated objective of the Putin clique is to wipe out Ukraine's national identity. And they are perfectly happy to accept Ukrainians who identify as Russians, but not Ukrainians who identify as Ukrainians. So in the face of this truly existential threat, the Ukrainian people have rallied behind their president. And whatever complaints you may have about Zelensky in the pre-invasion period, he has been an extraordinary and an effective war leader. And my sense from, at this point, I don't know, 10 or so trips to post-Russian invasion Ukraine is that Ukrainians understand this, the political leadership and the opposition understands this. And while there is a political opposition, they function as an ally in the government to make sure Ukraine wins this war. That is not to say, however, that they are blind. And I will say something which I have not said frequently, at least not in public frequently, since my first trip to post-invasion Ukraine, which is in September of 2022, that the civil society, and actually let me do a digression here, apologize for that, but it fits. It's amazing, but not surprising, if you look at it carefully, how Ukrainian civil society, which has largely been pushing hard for reform ever since Ukrainian independence, and been chewing at the heels of every president of Ukraine for not moving towards reform with enough speed and enough energy, how this sector as a whole pivoted once the big invasion began and had become major lobbyists in the West to give Ukraine both the military support it needs, the economic support too, but highlight first on military for obvious reasons, and move Ukraine towards NATO membership. And of course, it happened because they all understood that any talk about reform in Ukraine is irrelevant if Putin wins in Ukraine. So they pivoted to the national, and as the national interest dictated, to job one. And that includes, of course, Ukraine's Nobel laureate, Alexandra Matvichuk, who was a human rights lawyer working very much in civil society space. And now she comes to the United States, and she goes to Berlin, and she goes to elsewhere in Europe and pleads for arms. Of course, if you believe in human rights in Ukraine, you've got to arm the Ukrainians to stop Putin cold. Okay, now that's the digression. Come back to the political opposition and democracy in Ukraine and coalescing Ukrainian identity. I heard in Kiev in September of 22 in private. I've heard this thousands of times since, both in Ukraine and in the United States, from visiting opposition figures, and for that matter, from civil society figures. They have noticed some of the centralizing tendencies in Ukraine's politics since the big invasion. And yes, centralized power is essential to defeat an enemy in war, especially an enemy that is 3 times as large as you in population and 10 times as large as you in economic production. And again, vicious as hell. Centralization is essential. But they've known maybe some of that centralization has gone beyond what's necessary to defeat a truly nasty enemy and to enhance the political circumstances of the current government and its political party. That's reflected, of course, in the media monopoly. That's reflected, of course, in the restrictions on opposition politicians going to the West. By the way, it's notable that in the first 6 months after the big invasion, such restrictions were very, very few. As the war situation stabilized, especially with the successful counteroffensive beginning in August of 22, they reemerged. But everyone said to me, look, he's still doing a great job as president. We have to win this war. We will take this up after the war is won. And that is very much on people's minds, that these new measures which have put some restrictions will be dealt with at the necessary time. And I think that's both politically wise, because again, you had to defeat this nasty foe. But they haven't forgotten. They want to emerge even more democratic after the war is over. And I think we'll see that. Okay, I addressed the first 2 parts of this conversation. The third was on an established yet tolerant national identity. This is very important, both for Ukraine's present and future, but also for winning the war. And let me explain. Probably I don't have to explain to you because you're a pretty sophisticated group. But you all know that there is some unpleasantness in Ukraine's history in terms of political toleration. Anti-Semitism did thrive in Ukraine for centuries. Truly unpleasant relations amongst other nationalities. I mean, there have been difficulties in Ukrainian-Polish relations going back centuries. Not to mention, of course, the problems in Ukrainian-Russian relationships within on the territory of Ukraine as well. Well, of course, you had a deus ex machina, which is a Kremlin imperial tendency, which Dan Fried described very ably. Point is, any fair look at post-independent Ukraine is struck by the extraordinary tolerance in Ukrainian society. Tolerance reflected in historically good relations between ethnic Ukrainians and Ukrainian Jews, and in real rapprochement with some problems over the past 10 or so years in Ukrainian-Polish relationships. Truly extraordinary. And I saw that when I was in Kiev during the Orange Revolution, how religious leaders across the whole spectrum who wanted a truly independent and democratic Ukraine merged on the Maidan, my Maidan, you might say, in 2004, but also on the more recent and even more impressive Maidan of 2014. Of course, the one political faction, faction's a terrible word to use, the one political group that was absent on the 2004 Maidan, they were with the would-be oppressors, and on the 2014 Maidan, they were with the would-be oppressors, whereas the Moscow Patriarch Orthodox Church in Ukraine. But everyone else was there, or virtually everyone else was there. And we all know how the Kremlin has been pushing the theme of repression of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine today. And I would agree that Ukraine could be a little bit, Ukrainian's government and Rada could be a little bit defter in handling that. But the true repression in Ukraine on the religious field comes in Russian-occupied Ukraine, where we've seen the murder and torture of priests across the spectrum, especially Ukrainian Orthodox priests, Ukrainian Uniates, and especially evangelicals and Protestants of all stripes, who've been treated as sectarians advocating a Western agenda. And the fact that this is actually pretty well known now, thanks to the remarkable efforts of Pavlo Ungarian, the Ukrainian former Rada member, a pastor, and an American Republican in Ukraine, Stephen Moore, who's done terrific work on this too, getting out the word. But the point is, Ukraine has consolidated, established a truly admirable, tolerant society, which is just one more reason why we should be giving you all the arms to defeat Putin and his bully boys and girls. I say girls with a reference to Zaharova and Simonyan and some others. The point is, Ukraine's achievement in developing a democracy in difficult circumstances, in developing a tolerant society, which it kind of had at the start of its great independent adventure, but has increased since, including since the big war began 2.5 years ago. It's truly a remarkable achievement, and it's only partly understood here in the West. And we've got to do a better job. And by we, I mean Ukraine's American friends who understand that if you lose, it's an historic tragedy for you of epic proportions, but a major geopolitical defeat for us. And Dan talked about the way we have only blindly and slowly and with missteps, meaning we, the United States, our political leadership, moved in the right direction. We've got to do more to make sure that happens, that movement happens faster and more directly. With that, this has become a little bit of a sermon, and I apologize for that. I'll open the floor to questions and comments, and of course, since I've been speaking, complaints. Please. Boris, your second.
Oh, that's loud. I guess one question that I have is, in light of recent events with the election in Georgia, with Georgian Dream basically stomping that election, the elections in Moldova, and Nicole Pashinyan basically taking power, basically on the platform that he was going to be anti-Russian and progressively becoming more friendly with Putin. Is that a reflection of Russia changing their tactics after seeing that a military invasion in Ukraine failed? Or is the military resistance in Ukraine a testament to the national identity and Russian resistance inherent in the Ukrainian people?
Thank you. David, do you want to give that a shot?
Sure. Well, first, John, let me just say I'm very pleased you spoke up the way you did. I agree with everything you said, and grateful for your comments. I want to reinforce. My boss, President Bush, has referred to Zelensky as the Winston Churchill of our time. And Churchill, of course, was not a perfect leader during the war in World War II, but got Great Britain through that. And Zelensky, I'm confident.
The Churchill's responsible for the continuation and the escalation of World War II.
Yeah, well, I won't go there. And couldn't agree more. John, you and I have talked about this endlessly and written about it. This is the fight in the world today. This is where everything is at stake. And if we don't do what you describe, what we've described in the past, many people sitting around that table I can see have called for, which is not just to help Ukraine defend itself. That is not good enough, but to help Ukraine win, to defeat Russian forces so that this never happens again, then we have failed Ukraine. I have full confidence in the Ukrainians to prevail in this war. I have less confidence in us to help them prevail. And that's something that we have control over, and we better do a much better job than we have so far. Credit for what's been done to a degree, but I don't want us to break our arms patting ourselves on the back because we don't deserve that. On the question that was asked, Georgia is a country that is incredibly pro-Western, pro-American, pro-EU, pro-NATO, pro-democracy. Surveys that have been conducted show numbers above 80% reflecting those views and attitudes. what's happened is the Georgian Dream, which won elections in 2012 and then 2013, has come in and captured the state. And the country is under the thumb of a pro-Russian oligarch, a billionaire, Benzina Ivanishvili, who made his fortune in Russia and is carrying out Russia's work for the Russians, and moving in a pro-Russian direction, also causing severe disruption in Georgian Ukrainian relations when the two countries should have an enormous amount in common. I wrote a piece John referenced at the beginning in Foreign Policy yesterday with Ian Kelly, in which we basically say the results are illegitimate in Georgia. It is impossible to explain how Georgian Dream could have gone from between 30 and at best 40% in pre-election surveys to 53% in the final results, without engaging in real fraud. And the tabulation of the votes may have been accurate, but it's everything that led up to the election day that was the problem. So Russia doesn't have to do much in Georgia, though it is, because Ivanishvili is carrying out the agenda for them. Moldova is different. Moldova is a very divided state with a very pro-Western, pro-democratic president. But Moldova is deeply divided with tremendous Russian influence, including efforts to buy several 100,000 votes that has been exposed by the Moldovan government. I think more attention needs to be brought to that. There'll be the runoff election, but by a narrow margin, Moldovans did support keeping the EU and joining it as part of their aspirations. So I think there is continued hope for Georgia, and the reason is the people in both countries, but particularly Georgia, who Georgians are so pro-American and pro-Western. We have lots of influence in Georgia. We need to exercise it, and I think so far we have fallen well short of doing so. Sorry for the long answer.
Good answer, thank you. Of course.
Thank you. I would like to express gratitude to all participants of this panel. I would like to make two comments on what you said, John. This is about the existential question. What will happen if Ukraine loses? This is the question which is being posed quite often in Ukraine, including from the President Zelensky and other influential leaders. Well, to my mind, the question, the answer to this question by President Zelensky is very simple. Other countries to west of Ukraine will fill the war. So this is the answer to the question. One of the answer of President Zelensky was misinterpreted. He said that if Ukraine loses, you will see nuclear weapons in Ukraine. He did not mean nuclear weapons of Ukraine. It means nuclear weapons, meaning nuclear weapons of Russia, will be placed in Ukraine if Ukraine loses. So this is a really existential question, an existential end of the Russian-Ukraine military confrontation. The second comment you made, well, despite of the war, of large-scale war of 1922, Ukraine is successfully pursuing reforms. I cannot but agree with you. Ukraine never ever been closer to both EU and NATO. And this was the result of the reaction to the war of Russia, which consolidated all elites in Ukraine around the strategic objectives, that is to join European Union and to join NATO. As a person who was pursuing this policy line for decades, I must admit that never ever before Ukraine was so closer to these objectives than now during the Russian war. I thank you very much for these comments.
Thank you. Next question or comment?
This question is for Ambassador Herbst, and if you're talking about centralization, what do you mean with specificity? Because we've had discussions and we've seen that larger centralized systems overcome smaller decentralized or not fully centralized systems. So when you're talking about that specifically, what does it mean? And when we talk about corruption, it's always mentioned third or fourth. Now we have a situation where the logistics chain of the military is compromised. So how does the West or our expert community expect to fix that without addressing it specifically?
I'm sorry, without addressing specifically,
Yeah, without addressing it directly, head on.
okay, I'll start with the second part of your question. I think that we meaning the United States, and I suspect also our NATO partners who are providing substantial military aid to Ukraine, a fairly effective system for monitoring the delivery and the use of the equipment. I have some idea about what it looks like in terms of electronic identification of weapon systems, tagging them as we watch them move from one spot to another. And there have been a couple of, I'd say, relatively small scandals regarding Western assistance, relatively small compared to the overall amount of assistance delivered. So I am relatively confident. I say relatively because, there could always be some scandal about to burst, that the record thus far is pretty good. As to the question of centralization, I've already conceded that in wartime, centralization is natural and necessary. But I did refer to specific things relating to political activity, which is not probably necessary. So there's no reason why there need to be obstacles towards senior Ukrainian political figures who are not part of the government traveling to West to beat the drums for more Western assistance. But we know this has been happening. And I consider them to be venial sins to a performance by the government, by Bankova, which is heroic and extraordinary, but it's still there. And again, I think those will be addressed in due course as the system permits. But let me make one more observation regarding centralization and effectiveness in war. I am absolutely certain, and I rarely use that phrase, absolutely certain, that the relative decentralization in Ukraine in this war effort, compared certainly to Russia, is an advantage. And we see it in one area where Ukraine has enjoyed, surprising to some, but in any case, extraordinary success. And that is in the adaptation of drone technology. If you go back just a year, you were hearing people who've consistently gotten this war wrong, I'm talking about Westerners, say the Russians are going to overwhelm Ukraine with drones. You were hearing that in October of last year, in the summer of last year, and even as late as early this year. And what's happened with drones? We've seen innovation. I mean, American tech culture talk about garage development, and Ukraine talk about kitchen development. The kitchen development of a decentralized Ukrainian scientific talent has created these world-class drones that are at least several months ahead of the Russians in this still emerging and evolving area, which is producing real punishment on Russian oil refineries and Russian military installations. And this has been an extraordinary achievement, thanks to, again, a mobilized society, a society that's mobilized the way the Russian society is not, because the Russian people are not really in this war. The Ukrainian people are in this war because they understand the stakes. Next question or comment?
Specific question towards panelist Majdanek. And as you
I like the way you
mentioned,
pronounce that.
What was that?
I like the way you pronounce that.
How do you pronounce it?
I like the way you pronounce it. Yeah.
Majdanek, yeah. So my question being is,
in my opinion, the Maidan is not nearly talked about enough. Especially now with the war, when everybody mentions that the war started back in 2014 and not just now in 2022. I feel like when we speak of that, we should actually add the Maidan as the biggest example. And for example, even in high schools, they teach about Russian Revolution, and they educate the Americans on that topic, but nobody mentions Maidan. And to underline what Ambassador Herb said, that Ukraine is basically not recognized enough to get into NATO. Do you think that if we talked about Maidan more as an example of not even just the government, but the people themselves being able to basically overthrow the government and how strong the people are, do you think that would basically make a stronger case for Ukraine to get into NATO?
Thanks. I definitely agree with, yes, it would, and I do think, and it goes with a battle of my Ukrainian-born wife and my son, who seem to go for the Putin. They seem to think that Yanukovych was forced out by the West, and that we meddled. So I agree, a fair telling of the disgusting what Yanukovych stood for, the Russian support, the failed election, the corrupt election, how he came to power is a great story to tell. But I think you're talking about something else. I think you're talking about the snipers and the Heavenly Hundred, and the way that there should be memorials built to these incredible heroes of the Maidan. And if we did more of that and made it much more aware, we would understand that the Russia war started with the little green men, Yalta, the taking over of Crimea. So your point is on point, that we do need to, you're talking about the Maidan of 2000, starting November 2013, not the Orange Revolution, I assume. Well, then I'm in full agreement, and we should make more of it, but why don't I turn to the pros?
John, maybe can I just add to what Lewis said, which is it's also important for people in the West to understand that it was Putin again who triggered the Maidan Revolution in 2013 because he pressured Yanukovych not to sign agreements, not with NATO, despite all the analysts in the West who like to point the finger at NATO enlargement as being responsible for all of this, but with the European Union. And that's what triggered people to turn out into the streets protesting Yanukovych's U-turn. He had planned to sign these agreements. And as Lewis said, Yanukovych fled the country. He wasn't ousted. He fled like a coward. He wasn't overthrown. And this had nothing to do with NATO. But it's also a reminder that Ukraine, I think, I'm trying to think of other examples, I think is the only country that within a decade had two pro-democratic, pro-Western revolutions, 2004 and 2013-14. And it just underscores that Ukrainians rise to the challenge, they rise to the occasion. As John, you were describing about their ability to develop drone technology, their innovation is just incredible, and their courage in the face of a much bigger, more threatening enemy is also extraordinary, and I don't think should be taken for granted, particularly by Western analysts who got this so badly wrong. Some of whom argued in January of 2022 in foreign policy that we shouldn't arm Ukraine because it won't make any difference. The Ukraine is going to lose anyway. And those people, in my view, frankly, have blood on their hands, because those arguments argued against the very thing that Ukraine needed before the full-scale invasion, and that was Western military assistance. And even without a major Western military assistance, Ukraine has done an extraordinary job. And as you rightly pointed out, they know why they're fighting. They're fighting for their country, for their freedom, for their lives. And most of the Russians and now North Koreans and other immigrants who have been deceived into going to fight have no clue why they're there. Morale is an incredibly important thing in all this. It's impossible to measure. And it's one reason I've argued that we should keep an eye on the morale of the Russian forces on the front lines. That's what will determine the outcome of this war, not the attitudes of Russians inside Russia. It's impossible to measure those in a a totalitarian system anyway, but it's the Russians on the front line. And it's important that we maintain the morale of the Ukrainians on the front line by providing them the tools they need to win this war.
David, I think that's the final word. We're at the witching hour. Thank you very much to our panelists. Great job.
Thank you.
It's an honor to be. Thank you. Always a pleasure.
I would say good luck with the Yankees, John, but I don't mean it.
Yeah.
You will live to regret that day.
They got a 4-game sweep coming up.
No, there's no 4-game sweep.
But, thank you, David. Thank you for saying that. You know that.
Are we going right in or are you doing?
No, I'm gonna be saying, folks, I'm gonna give a 5-minute coffee break before we reassemble, so.